Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keough-Naughton. I'm the O'Donnell Chair of Irish Studies, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Keough-Naughton Institute of Irish Studies. We are very delighted and honoured to have amongst us Clair Wills, who spent a year, if I'm correct, here in 2012, 6 months, as the O'Donnell Distinguished Visiting Professor. Claire is now the King Edward VII Professor of English Literature at the University of Cambridge. She is somebody, I think, who, when other academics look at her and her work, their eyes go green with envy, because she is that rare individual who has made the transition from the academic book to the trade book, to writing not the type of book that you will share with your fellow scholars and that you hope the university library will buy, but the type of book that everybody will read. And this has been the case, I think, for the last 3 publications, that Neutral Ireland, A Cultural History of Ireland During World War II, which was published by Faber in 2007. And also when she published her history of post-war Britain, of emigration in post-war Britain, which was called Lovers and Strangers, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize in 2017. Claire also writes for the New York Review of Books, for the London Review of Books, but she's come to us today to talk about this book, Missing Persons or My Grandmother's Secret. And as you may have gathered from the photograph on the cover, as I say to my students, the paratext is always important. This is a story of Claire's family, of her grandmother, of her family in County Cork. But I think more important than that, it is a story of all Irish people, and not just the Irish people who live on the island of Ireland, but of the story of the diaspora. It's a very important work, and so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Claire, and I'm sure we will all listen in rapture to what she has to say.
Thanks, Cleona, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I've called my talk Making Sense of the Missing, the Family, the Church and the Home in 20th Century Irish Society, which is quite an ambitious topic. I want to ask, how should we approach the aftermath of the scandals of institutional abuse in Ireland? What questions should we be asking about guilt, blame, and responsibility? It's annoying, that noisy door, isn't it? You can't sneak in. This talk will trace a history of sexual secrecy in Ireland from the post-famine period to the 1950s and beyond, asking how and why did families consent to the institutional care and control of unmarried mothers and their children? In other words, why did the system make sense to ordinary families, and how can we make sense of it now? I'm going to be talking in particular about the aftermath of institutional control of women and children, and specifically the mother and baby home scandal that's been unfolding in Ireland for just over 10 years now, following the work of the historian Catherine Corliss and the discovery of the bodies of nearly 800 babies and small children hidden in a septic tank on the grounds of the former mother and baby home in Tuam, County Galway. And following the subsequent government commission of investigation into the systems of managing extramarital pregnancies in Ireland from 1922 to the 1990s. I'm interested in particular in how we measure the fault line between public and private responsibility, the state and the family. I'm aware, of course, that although the family is a domain of intimate personal relationships, it would be wrong, simply inaccurate, to categorise it as a private institution as opposed to public state enterprises, such as industrial schools, Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, and other church-run social services. Where the fault line runs between public and private spheres, if it runs at all, is one of the questions I'm posing. For that reason, I'm continuing to use the word homes in discussing the legacy of the mother and baby institutions, despite the fact that many survivors of these institutions themselves refused to use the term homes. They weren't domestic spaces, they point out. They were effectively institutions of incarceration. And to use the word home is to deny that fact. I don't disagree with this at all, but my point today is to try to analyse the ways in which the family home, too, is a social institution, implicated in the public sphere. And for that reason, I still find the word home useful. I mean by this that it still does useful work. Although my argument is primarily a historical rather than a theoretical one, I bear in mind too the history hidden in the words family and home, the familiar, the homely, the unhomely. And here I'm glancing at Freud's work on the uncanny, the unheimlich, which carries within itself the heimlich, or the homely. Freud defined the uncanny as, and I'm quoting, that class of frightening things that leads us back to what is known and familiar. For Freud, and for a century of Freudians writing in his wake, the heimlich, the homely, refers both to what is most familiar, familial, and what is most hidden. He is thinking particularly of the mother's body as the first home. In the homely is hidden the strange, the frightening, the displaced, and at its furthest reach, the homeless. Another way we might put this is that the uncanny carries the canny, the knowing and the known within it, but denies it and covers it over. I want to return to that thought when considering the relationship between knowing and acknowledging that which is frightening in the family home. The familial, the everyday, the homely, and the domestic, each functions through its own operations of violence, exclusion, and displacement. The philosopher Stanley Cavell, in his essay Knowing and Acknowledging, calls this the surrealism of the habitual. He says, the difficulty of grasping what is before our eyes is not lack of knowledge, but acknowledgement. And that is one thread I will be following in this talk. I'm going to offer a few basic reminders of the mother and baby home scandal, and I apologise in advance to those of you who are extremely familiar with this history. The network of institutions that developed in the late 19th and earlier 20th century to manage sex and the consequences of sex in Ireland included the notorious Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, county homes, orphanages, and industrial schools. These were homes where children were taught industry, which for girls meant mostly being trained for domestic service and for boys farm labouring. You might think here of the homeboy Bill Evans in John McGahern's That They May Face the Rising Sun. Beside the Lake, I think, is its title here. Bill Evans's backstory is barely sketched in the novel. Part of McGahern's point here, I think, is that everybody knows about the children who have been brought up in the homes, so nothing needs to be said, nothing needs to be explained. They know, but they don't acknowledge what is in front of them. Now in his 50s, although his age is indeterminate like everything else about him, Bill Evans is enslaved to a shadow farming couple who live up the hill from the Rutledges beside the lake. And the injustice is seen but unspoken. The set of social institutions, homes and orphanages were run by religious orders, mostly Catholic, though there were some Protestant homes. James Joyce's story, Clay, is partly set in one of them. But following independence, they were funded by the Irish state through a system of payments for mothers and children. Basically, they were a cheap way for the Irish state to provide a range of social services, as the nuns didn't get paid for their work. And those services were all built around forms of incarceration. The bargain was a deprivation of liberty in exchange for care, a term I'm using in quotation marks for both mothers and children. The mother and baby homes provided a way of tidying the problem of illegitimacy behind closed doors. Between Irish independence in 1922 and 1998, when the last of these institutions closed, they were home at the lowest estimate to 56,000 unmarried mothers, ranging from 12-year-old girls to women in their 40s, and at least 57,000 babies and small children. There were similar institutions in the United States, Britain, and many European countries. Nowhere else were they still in use as late as the 1990s. The proportion of unmarried mothers who were admitted to these homes in the 20th century in Ireland was probably the highest in the world, but that is not the only Irish anomaly. Irish women also stayed longer in these homes than anywhere else, with the longest stays occurring in the 1940s and 50s. In 2014, a commission was set up to investigate the homes, following the discovery of the bodies in the septic tank at Keough. There is a lot to say about the commission, how it operated, and what it found. A central finding was that in many of the homes, including Keough and Bessborough in Cork, children were not cared for. In fact, in the 40 years following independence, being born in or living in one of the homes considerably lessened a child's chances of survival. The Commission came to other conclusions about the manner in which the homes functioned, vaccine trials in the early 1960s, the treatment of non-white children, and coerced adoption, all of which conclusions have proved controversial. But here I want to focus on the finding that caused the most controversy, outrage, I would say, which is that the primary responsibility for the treatment of women and children in the homes, and I'm quoting, rests mainly with the fathers of their children and their own immediate families. It was supported by, contributed to, and condoned by the institutions of the state and the churches. Even if this statement were true, which I believe it is not, it gets us nowhere. The attempt to parcel out blame for the treatment of unmarried mothers and their children, either to the institutional system or to families, is a misunderstanding of the nature of this history. I don't deny that families, my own included, made use of the homes. But what needs to be explained is why people consented to the system. Why did this system make sense to them? I think we can learn something about this from literature. McGahern's novel is a good example. What he shows in the plotline involving Bill Evans, the homeboy, is a small community tolerating human cruelty and injustice in the very next house, the very next farm, just behind the hedge, just over the back field. There's embarrassment and awkwardness about the social consequences of a farming culture insistent upon respectability. Bill Evans is a kind of relic of a system that no one wants to condone now in the period in which the novel is set, sometime in the 1970s. But the plot also insists on the economic gains for the legitimate, the landowning farmer, of this system built on the cheap labour of those who are illegitimate. The temporal markers in the novel are deliberately confusing. We can't tell at points whether we are in the 1950s, the 1970s, or even the 1990s when the book was written. And it's through these historical obscurities that McGahern is most articulate about the long aftermath of the abuse as it occurs inside families and farms, and is continued in the family home rather than the institutional home. Or we could take Edna O'Brien's 1972 novel, A Pagan Place. Again, the novel is an extraordinary indictment of the respectable farming family. The main character's older sister falls pregnant and is sent to a mother and baby home in Dublin and never returns, while the narrator herself is abused by a priest and rejects the family who failed to support and protect her by, and this is a brilliant twist, becoming a nun. In France, we could talk about that. Here we see a shift from the violence of the family to the relative safety of the institution. Or we could think of the threads of stories touching on extramarital pregnancy, abortion, infanticide, and class in the early fictions of Molly Keane and Dorothy McCardle, or John B. Keane's work, his 1959 play, Sive, for example, or the work of the popular dramatist M.J. Malloy in the 1950s and 60s, whose plays often focused on a class struggle between the illegitimate and the respectable, and in the case of his 1953 work, The Wood of the Whispering, on the role of institutions in policing that boundary. Or think of Mouth in Beckett's Not I, whose verbal gestures suggest she has been born in an institution. What I am gesturing towards here in this list of examples is the work of acknowledgement that writers were pushing towards in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. This world is touched on differently by Patrick Kavanagh in The Green Fool, Terry Flynn, and The Great Hunger, which we might think of as comic and tragic versions of the same story. And I'd like to suggest that many of the literary representations of single men in this period also gesture towards the unspoken histories of these institutions. You see these lonely, bewildered, or defensive men everywhere in mid-century Irish literature. In Beckett, John McGahern, Tom Murphy, John B. Keane. I'm thinking particularly of Beckett's 1965 play for television, A. Joe. These men very rarely get a backstory that has to do with sex or the politics of sexual respectability. That story is reserved for women who bear all the signs of it in their bodies. But the fathers are part of the story. Thousands of men whose futures were curtailed, often by choice, insofar as choice is a factor in this history, and who never knew their children. I think the brutality of that experience has not yet been acknowledged. In Missing Persons, I wanted to excavate a more private history, and at this point I'm going to try to execute a tricky swerve away from literature that we're probably all more comfortable discussing, to a more personal history, one that was my way in to the history of consent to the institutions. At the heart of my recent research is the life and death of one of the people who went missing from my own family, my first cousin Mary, who was born in an Irish mother and baby home, Bessborough in Cork, in 1955, and brought up in an orphanage or an industrial school attached to the Convent of Mercy in Clonakilty, and who I never got to know. She was the daughter of my uncle and a neighbour, Lily, who was 19 when she got pregnant. I found out about Mary when I was in my 20s, when it was too late to meet her, although she was only 7 years older than me. And I spent decades trying to come to terms with the fact that she had been kept secret from us. In my own family's case, the family farm, the home, was a place of exclusion as well as belonging. Initially, I thought the story I had to tell was Mary's story and that of her mother. I felt it as a kind of duty to do justice to the people who were shunned by the family and forced into institutions. It took me a long time to understand that, in fact, my story concerned the people who did the shunning. Central to this is the figure of my grandmother, who refused to accept my cousin as part of the family and never saw her son, Mary's father, again. I wanted to understand how a woman I knew very well when I was a child, a woman I loved, could have consented to a system which to us, just a few generations later, seems immeasurably unjust and cruel. I wanted to call the book Making Sense of the Missing. That was my working title, and I meant by it two things. How did my grandmother and the others who were involved in disappearing my cousin make sense of what they were doing? Where did the sense of shame and the need to keep illegitimacy secret come from? What was the work it did for families? The fact that my family functioned despite and maybe even because of its missing persons, the fact that it made enough sense is part of my inheritance and the inheritance of a great many people of my generation. I wanted to understand through writing the book not only what happened to the women who fell on the wrong side of sexual morality and social respectability, the women who ended up in the homes and their children, but also why it happened. Why did my uncle abandon Lily? Why did my grandmother refuse to acknowledge her grandchild? There are archival records for the institutions that governed and controlled Irish sexual and reproductive lives. The mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, orphanages, and industrial schools are all very well documented internally. But there are no written sources explaining the behaviour of the families of the women and children who ended up in these institutions, or there are very few. If I wanted to understand why families consented to the institutions, it made sense to start with my own family and the sources that were available to me. The secrets that were kept in the family and those that weren't. The ellipses and misdirections built into the stories through which the family understood itself, and the generational battles over codes of behaviour, including who has the right to tell secrets and when. In the end, I came to understand that I am one of the records in this story. How sex and illegitimacy and the family has been policed in Britain and Ireland through the 20th century is archived in me and my own attitudes, right down to the decision when I got pregnant as a student in the late 80s to go ahead and have the baby on my own. So this is an intimate history, literally so, in that I'm investigating illicit sex and extramarital pregnancy, but it's also public. My family was not unusual. Tens of thousands of women and girls were sent to mother and baby homes over the decades, and hundreds of thousands of people shunned them and their children. My grandmother's views on the importance of respectability and legitimate inheritance were typical. When Missing Persons was published in Ireland in January, I did some media interviews, and they nearly always started with a request to tell the interviewer about my grandmother. Tell us about your granny then. And I ended up feeling that this line of questioning was getting it wrong. I started saying in response, my granny is your granny. And although the interviewers looked a bit surprised, to their credit, they did get the point, that this is a personal story, but it's also about a very common, almost universal situation in which some people were allowed to belong in families and others weren't, and not only in Ireland. This is where we might find ourselves pivoting on that pin between knowing and acknowledging. So, I'm interested in how a kind of violence gets covered over or disavowed and remembered at the same time. The church-state institutions that were set up to contain the poor, the sexually wayward, and the mentally ill weren't in themselves secret, of course. They were in the business of secrecy. The mother and baby homes and orphanages thrived in the 1950s and 60s as a way of keeping sex and pregnancy hidden, and the women and children were collateral damage. The system was highly visible, bureaucratic, and officially sanctioned. It is precisely because such a huge amount of information about the homes and how they functioned was recorded that we now have the 3,000-page report of the Commission of Investigation, created on the basis of all that recorded information. So the system was highly visible and involved a great many people, officials of church and state, yet it was barely talked about. And that contradiction shaped families too, and the way people understood their own experiences. Whatever you say nothing, the knowing injunction memorialized by Seamus Heaney in a different context applies here too. In order to uncover how people in my family thought about illicit sex, illegitimacy, and institutions, I ended up following the tracks laid down in family stories and anecdotes. There were so many stories that petered out, or that ended in gaps and ellipses and said nothing. I tried to interpret those gaps, the missing bits, as places where the past was both preserved and disavowed. So, I've also been asking, how can I make sense of this now, as the inheritor of that history? I'm part of the historical archive. The remembering and forgetting is in me, whether I like it or not. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to interpret the gaps and silences and holes in my own understanding and in the stories that were handed down to me and the stories that were kept from me. In fact, one of the things I discovered while writing the book is that not only does my family stretch a very long way back in only a few generations, my great-grandparents were born in the 1830s and 1840s, but in every generation, we've had children outside marriage. It turned out that my grandmother herself had been pregnant before marriage in 1920, and there's a possibility, perhaps I should say a likelihood, that she may herself have been born out of wedlock in the early 1890s. I became fascinated by the different systems that developed to manage an unplanned pregnancy across a century or more, the different ways in which the secret of an unplanned pregnancy might be kept, and in particular, how sexual secrecy operated in the period before independence. There were all sorts of ways that an unplanned pregnancy could be managed informally in late Victorian and Edwardian Ireland. Abortion and infanticide, obviously, and it's worth pointing out here that juries were very reluctant to convict when these came to trial, but also shotgun weddings, informal fostering out, babies brought up by an aunt or a grandmother. I argue in the book that keeping sexual secrets in this period was a way for women to look out for one another. They had so little autonomy, so little control over their own lives, that keeping one another's secrets, covering them over, was one means of caring for each other. And I suggest that these habits of secrecy developed in a period when the authorities and institutions were associated with an alien rule, the police force, the workhouses, the county homes, and so on, left people with very few defences against the new Catholic institutions that came into operation after independence. I've got a paragraph here on Catholicism in 19th century Ireland, and I'm very frightened because Colin Barr is over there. This is all for several decades after the famine, the Catholic Church had a shaky hold on the rural Irish poor. There weren't enough churches or priests or nuns to go round. My grandfather was born in 1877, the youngest child of a Protestant labourer and a Catholic servant. The children were brought up Protestant, but their mother went to Mass in the Catholic Church every morning, and this was not unusual, not every morning, every week, particularly among the very poor. But a generation later, it would be unthinkable. The church steadily tightened its hold on its parishioners through the late decades of the 19th century, a massive church-building campaign, a drive for vocations, It was a civilizing mission, if you like. And one of the consequences was the transformation of Irish family life. If we are trying to figure out why families consented to the institutions, the increasing power of the Catholic Church is obviously central. The deference to homegrown Catholic religious authority after independence, a kind of fatalistic acceptance of one's lot, a genuine belief in the sinfulness of the body. There are lots of threads that join together to make this particular piece of social fabric. And imagine how reassuring to find that the problem of extramarital pregnancy was going to be solved by the Church. It was as though the business of intimate relationships was handed over to a church-state bureaucracy to manage. Suddenly, here was your local priest, or your aunt, the nun, or your friends, neighbours saying, "The mother and baby home will keep your secret for you." It must have seemed the sensible thing to do if you wanted to preserve your respectability, to hand your daughter over to the priest to manage the problem. I suggest in the book that rural Irish families didn't really have much defence against what appeared to be a benign form of social welfare. This was their own people saying, "We'll keep your secret for you." But I don't underestimate the terrible experiences of loss and pain that families went through by consenting to this system. I've been focusing on the authority of the Church, but a large part of the story of consent needs to be understood as a consequence of struggles over land ownership. Recently, President Michael D. Higgins has been talking about the centenary of the 1923 Land Act at almost every opportunity. This is the act which allowed tenants to buy their own farms by either confiscating estates from landlords or forcing them to sell through compulsory purchase orders. The culmination of land agitation and a series of legal challenges since the 1880s. As Michael D. argues, following work by Terence Dooley and others, the Land Acts punctuate the decline of landlordism. But the transformation in land ownership also created a new class. The new owners who were getting or expanding their acreage in the early 20th century were, as it were, homegrown. They weren't absentee landlords. Instead, they were right in lockstep with the religion and nationalist prerogatives of the new church and state. And in Higgins' words, it was as a consequence of the 1923 Act, and I'm quoting here, the alliance of land before people, authoritarianism, misogyny, and distrust of the body as sinful came to define the 1930s awful legacy of repression. Between 1955 and 1960, over 250,000 people would emigrate, largely to Britain. While the greatest beneficiaries of land reform were the middle class of medium-sized farmers, for those who stayed, an authoritarian state would, during the 1930s, implement policies that endorsed what Higgins calls, and I'm quoting again, a carnival of conservatism, reaction, small-mindedness, division, repression, and abuse, the consequences of which still play out among us today. Higgins has focused on the impact of the Land Acts on those without land, both those who never acquired it in 1923. His own father missed out as he was interned in the Curragh at the time, but also those who did not inherit, the surplus people who were neither going to be the one inheriting male or the one daughter with a dowry, the surplus relatives assisting on farms, or those leaving for England whose emigrant remittances were so welcome, but whose personal arrivals or retirements were greeted on occasion with, "What are you doing home?" or "When are you going back?" I think what is missing from Higgins' analysis is a recognition of the impact of the 1923 Land Act on those who did inherit land, or those who were able to buy land, as my grandparents did, after my grandfather inherited money from a brother who had gone to America in the 1880s. It's here, I think, that, to quote Higgins again, the misogyny and the distrust of the body as sinful make themselves most felt, because once you have land, you have to worry about legitimate inheritance. President Higgins signs off a recent address on the Land Acts with the following assertion. He says, "It is very hard to disagree with Professor Joe Lee's statement when he described how before the Great Famine, fields gave way to families, whereas after the famine, families gave way to fields." The statement comes from J.J. Lee's Ireland 1912 to 1985, and of course derives from Patrick Kavanagh's The Great Hunger, specifically Patrick Maguire's advice, mother's advice to him in praise of the man who made the field his bride. The sacrifice of the family for the sake of land ownership came in many guises, from the refusal of farmers to marry, to the refusal of women like my grandmother to countenance her son's marriage to a woman she considered sexually wayward. You may recall that earlier I said my grandmother herself had been pregnant before marriage, but that was when she was a servant. The man she married was a farm labourer. In 1920, neither her own family nor her lovers owned any land, and legitimacy in that context bears far less weight. In kind of awful, warped way, the money from America that my family inherited was the cause of exclusion, because now there was a farm to inherit. To return to the questions I posed at the beginning, how do we approach the aftermath of the scandals of institutional abuse in Ireland? What questions should we be asking about guilt, blame, and responsibility? My own feeling is that outside of legal claims for reparation and financial redress, both of which I see as absolutely vital and necessary, but outside of those legal claims against the state, the term responsibility is not a useful word to bring to this history, because it so quickly falls into binary arguments about blame and guilt. I've tried to think in terms of a wider category of answerability or obligation. In this wider sense, I am answerable to this history. I got to belong when my cousin didn't. I have suffered the loss of my cousin, but I also benefited in complex ways from her absence. I think that people feel relatively comfortable when I say I feel responsible for, in the sense of answerable to, this injustice. But they do not always feel comfortable when I suggest that they are too. My granny is your granny. Not everyone wants to go there. I recognise the value of secret keeping. It is not all about shame. Maintaining reserve is one way that people living in small communities can continue to live with one another, for example. There is a kind of power associated with secrets, but also a form of care. Maybe this has partly to do with a society that makes use of the confessional. There's a power in telling secrets, but also a power in keeping them. And the figure of the priest is a good reminder of that. But secrets outlive their usefulness, and they become more dangerous in their posthumous incarnations. My family kept the secrets of sex and pregnancy and childbirth for a mixture of reasons, and some of them were good. But there is no sense in keeping those secrets anymore. We will never make sense of the missing if we don't talk about them. We will never accept our own accountability unless we address this history. I think that is precisely what the figure of Bill Evans in Beside the Lake is asking of us. McGahern has put him there to try to get us to acknowledge how we all turn away and hope to avoid questions about our own complicity and the ways in which some of us in the aftermath of this history have become beneficiaries while others have not. A final thought takes me to Walter Benjamin and his wonderfully utopian vision in the Arcades project that the future is locked in the undiscovered aspects of the past, accessible through a methodology and practice honed by the ragpicker who brings the discarded remnants of history to new light. This is the key to the aftermath. The aftermath is the new growth that replaces the past that has been mown down and cast aside. If we are to have any hope of acknowledging the violence of the home, both familial and institutional, we must look to the people and stories that have been cast aside. Thank you for listening.